What if I told you the most impactful lives aren't always the loudest? What if true greatness isn't measured in spotlights, but in shadows? We chase fame. We crave recognition. But the Bible often reveals a different path. A path walked by silent pillars, by unseen giants, by people who changed the world without ever demanding applause. Today, we're talking about one of those giants. His name wasn't always Barnabas. He was born Joseph. Just another face in a sea of diaspora Jews. A Levite from Cyprus, not one of the original disciples. He never walked with Jesus. He doesn't even appear in the Gospels. So, how did this nobody become a cornerstone of the early church? How did he earn a name that defines an entire ministry? Because Joseph carried a seed, a rare, vital seed, a generous heart, an open mind, a faith ready to ignite. He was a Levite, yes, educated in the scriptures, familiar with the law, but living far from Jerusalem, in Cyprus, gave him a broader view. He knew tradition's weight, but he also saw people's value. This prepared him, unknowingly, to bridge impossible worlds. Worlds between Jew and Gentile, between persecuted and persecutor. When the early Christian faith exploded, when the apostles preached with fire, Joseph didn't hesitate. He saw something alive, something powerful, something undeniably true, and he made a choice that changed everything. The book of Acts tells us he sold a field he owned. He laid every single penny at the apostles' feet. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a casual offering. This wasn't pocket change. This was a complete, radical surrender of trust. A total divestment of his earthly security. Because of that single, audacious gesture, and because of the spirit he exuded, the apostles gave him a new name, Barnabas, son of consolation, son of encouragement. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a prophecy. An identity. It reflected his very essence. While others clamored for prominence, while some sought power, Barnabas was different. He was attentive to the hidden pain, to the quiet loneliness, to the unseen potential in those no one else wanted around. Before any fame, before any missionary journey, he was already a bridge, a living, breathing connection between the rejected and the chosen. His story starts in that quiet decision, that radical choice to give up something valuable, to invest everything in what God was doing. That choice, that single act, put him at the very center of the gospel's world, transforming power, and there, in that discreet beginning, one of Christianity's greatest encouragers was born. Are you willing to make a choice that defines you? A choice that might seem small to the world, but radical to God. What are you holding on to that God might be asking you to lay down? Not just as an offering, but as a complete surrender of trust. The kind of surrender that changes your name, your purpose, your very identity. This isn't a verse you'd frame. This isn't a beautiful title meant for a plaque. The name Barnabas wasn't just a label. It was a mission, a living definition of his identity, son of consolation, son of encouragement. And this mission wasn't a comfortable one. It was forged in crisis. Imagine the early Christian community in Jerusalem, young, fragile, surrounded by threats, persecution raged. Converts were wrestling with an entirely new faith in a deeply hostile world. People were wounded, insecure about the future, confused about how to live. They didn't need grand pronouncements. They needed Barnabas. Barnabas became the kind of person who knew how to listen without judging. Think about that. How rare is that today? He knew how to speak without hurting, to lift up without fanfare. He wasn't confined to meetings or speeches. He went where the discouraged were. He noticed those who arrived quietly. He saw the eyes that darted away, burdened by shame from their past. The consolation he carried wasn't made of empty words. It was built on actions, actions that restored dignity, actions that rekindled hope. The name he received was more than a reflection of his service. It filled his service with meaning. With every gesture, Barnabas became someone trustworthy, someone the apostles instinctively turned to, someone brothers and sisters sought when their strength failed. Instead of wanting to be seen, he chose to see others. Where many sought influence, he sought to serve. While some clung to positions of power, Barnabas clung to people. This is what made him a true son of encouragement. His faith wasn't abstract. It had eyes, it had ears, it had arms. This radical way of life would soon make him a bridge between worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. While many distrusted new converts, while some avoided mixing with anyone not Jewish, Barnabas already demonstrated an openness that clearly came from the Spirit of God. He understood a profound truth: grace doesn't respect borders. Grace doesn't care about reputations. So when someone completely unlikely like Saul appeared, Barnabas was ready, not because he was naive, not because he was reckless, but because he had already trained his heart to welcome. And so the meaning of his name would become the key that unlocked the very future of the church. Are you a son of consolation? Do your actions speak louder than your words? Do you truly see people, not just their labels or their past? Are you willing to be a bridge, even when it's uncomfortable? This isn't just about being nice. This is about being essential. It is about living out the name God has for you. What is that name? How are you embodying it today? Imagine betting your entire reputation on your worst enemy. Imagine vouching for the person who persecuted your friends, who approved the murder of your leaders, who literally hunted down everyone you loved. Sounds insane, right? But that's exactly what Barnabas did. When his story truly begins to take shape in the scriptures, he is no longer just Joseph, the Levite from Cyprus. He is Barnabas, the one everyone knew where to find when they needed comfort, direction, or a second chance. His name first appears in Acts 4, almost as a quiet footnote amidst a powerful scene of the early church. A church living a radical, practical faith, where no one claimed exclusive ownership of anything, everyone shared. In this radical scenario, a man appears. He decides to sell a property sought his own, not communal tzat, and gives all the money to the apostles' feet. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus. But at that moment, he began to be called Barnabas. It wasn't common for a Levite to own land. The Mosaic law stipulated that Levites would have no inheritance, for the Lord was their portion. But diaspora and historical changes meant Barnabas had stability, perhaps even prestige. He wasn't forced to give. His delivery was voluntary, generous, total. What makes this gesture even more remarkable? Immediately after this, we read the stark contrast of Ananias and Sapphira. They also sold property, but lied about the value. They sought recognition without true surrender. Barnabas gave everything in truth. They gave a part in deceit. One received honor and a new name. The others fell dead for their lie. Barnabas's first appearance then reveals everything about who he was. An attitude that was never forgotten. And it was that character, that deep well of trust, that allowed him to see what no one else could. Saul, the terror of Christians. He had cheered on Stephen's death. He had furiously persecuted followers of the Way. His conversion on the Damascus road was as unexpected as it was radical. But Christians still carried the fear. They remembered his face, his arrogance, his prisons. When Saul tried to join the disciples in Jerusalem, everyone recoiled. They distrusted. They thought it was a trap. That is when Barnabas stepped onto the scene. While everyone retreated, he approached. While the church saw a dangerous past, Barnabas saw a promising future. He took Saul to the apostles. He didn't just introduce him, he defended him. He recounted how Saul had seen the Lord on the road, how Jesus had spoken to him, how he was already preaching boldly in Damascus. Barnabas didn't just talk about what he heard. He talked about what he taught discerned font. He recognized a movement of God when he saw one. And there, before the distrustful eyes of the church leaders, he put his own reputation at risk. He gave a vote of confidence to someone who, moments before, was the enemy. This gesture changed history. From that moment on, Saul had the freedom to walk with the disciples, to participate in meetings, to grow in faith, to be molded for his future mission. Barnabas didn't just open a door. He held the door. He held the door open until Paul could enter completely. Without this act of courage and discernment, perhaps Paul would have remained on the sidelines for much longer. Perhaps his voice would have been stifled before it was ever heard. Barnabas wasn't naive. He wasn't sentimental. He knew the risks. But he also knew the voice of the Spirit. He knew when God was raising someone up, even if that person's past screamed otherwise. And because he trusted, he became the link, the bridge between the former persecutor and the persecuted apostles. This moment sealed a partnership that would soon transform the known world. The encourager and the theologian, the open heart and the sharp mind. Barnabas didn't just save Paul from exclusion. He prepared him for his calling. He invested in the invisible. He saw beyond the historical, beyond the scars, beyond the collective fear. And that is how one of the most impactful alliances of the New Testament begins. With a simple act of courage and faith, Barnabas sealed the fate of one of history's greatest apostles. Who are you afraid to bet on? Who has a past that makes you recoil? What if God is calling you to see a future in someone others have already dismissed? Is your discernment shaped by fear or by the voice of the Spirit? Are you willing to risk your own reputation to open a door for someone else? After opening the church's doors to Paul, Barnabas didn't just go back to his quiet life. He became a journey partner. In Acts 13, we see the Holy Spirit speaking directly to the leadership of the church in Antioch. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. They were the first missionaries officially sent by the Christian church. Not by personal ambition, but because heaven had pointed out their names. From there, a bold, challenging mission began, full of miracles, but also marked by fierce resistance and brutal persecution. The first stop was Cyprus, Barnabas's homeland. There, they preached in Jewish synagogues and faced direct spiritual opposition. A magician named Elymas tried to hinder the faith of an important Roman official. Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, firmly rebuked him, and the man was temporarily blinded. It was the first miracle of their journey. The proconsul Sergius Paulus believed the gospel, impacted by the authority of the word and the demonstration of power. After Cyprus, the journey continued to the regions of Pamphylia and Pisidia. In each city, Barnabas and Paul entered the synagogues. They preached boldly, and many believed, sought Jews and Gentiles alike. But conflicts also grew. In Antioch of Pisidia, for example, almost the entire city gathered to hear the word. This success infuriated the Jewish leaders who began to persecute the two missionaries. They were expelled from the city, but instead of retreating, they shook the dust off their feet and they moved forward. Full of joy, full of the Spirit, Barnabas, at this point, was no longer just the scene's encourager. He was in the squares, in the synagogues, in the middle of the crowds, preaching with authority. He faced opposition firmly, but without losing his meekness. They arrived in Lystra. They witnessed another miracle. A man paralyzed from birth was healed. The population was so impressed that they began to call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, thinking they were gods. But they tore their clothes in desperation, crying out, "We are only men like you." Fame didn't corrupt them. The focus was never on their own glory, but on pointing to the living God. Soon after, In Lystra itself, the tide turned. The crowd that had wanted to worship them now, influenced by hostile Jews from other cities, stoned Paul. They dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But Barnabas didn't abandon his friend. He stayed with him. He cared for him. He strengthened the newly born church in that city. The missionary journey was marked by transformed cities, by planted churches, by raised leaders, but also by closed doors, by threats, by violence, by painful farewells. Barnabas didn't back down. He had a clear calling, a courageous faith, and a heart willing to go wherever necessary for the gospel to reach those still living in darkness. How do you respond when success turns to persecution? When the crowd cheers one moment and stones you the next? Is your focus on your glory or God's? Are you willing to face opposition and still press forward, full of joy and the Spirit? What is your breaking point? What is your unwavering commitment to the gospel? Not all great partnerships last forever. Even among giants of faith, conflicts exist. Barnabas and Paul, who had walked together through so many cities, faced persecutions, and seen miracles side by side, reached a breaking point. And the cause of the break wasn't a theological issue. It wasn't an external threat, it was a person. John Mark, Barnabas's young cousin. During the first missionary journey, John Mark accompanied the two for a while, but at some point, he gave up. He went home. The Bible doesn't explain exactly why. Perhaps the sheer weight of the mission, perhaps fear, or even spiritual immaturity. The fact is, when Barnabas and Paul were preparing for a second trip, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark again. Paul, however, was firm in his refusal. For him, whoever had abandoned the work before didn't deserve a second chance at that moment. The conversation escalated to a discussion. The discussion turned to confrontation, and the confrontation led to separation. Acts 15 records that the disagreement was so intense that the two divided. Barnabas took John Mark and traveled to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and set off for another destination. Think about that, two spiritual giants, both full of the Spirit, but with profoundly different views on the same subject. Neither was explicitly called wrong. Neither was exalted as right. The Word of God simply shows, honestly, that there was a split, and that the mission continued, even so. Barnabas's attitude, however, reveals his core essence. He didn't abandon John Mark. He chose to give up the partnership with Paul rather than give up on someone he saw potential in. He was faithful to his name. Once again, he believed in someone discredited. Once again, he saw what no one else saw. That wasn't just a family choice. That was an act of profound faith. Barnabas didn't act on emotional impulse. He discerned with the eyes of his heart. He knew that growth takes time, that mistakes are part of the journey, and that grace isn't just for those who get it right the first time. This episode reveals that for Barnabas, the value of people was above efficiency. He saw the mission, yes, but he never despised the fragile along the way. Where others saw weakness, he saw a future in formation. His ministry was never about the number of cities reached or victories counted. It was about restoring, believing, lifting up, even if it cost him the partnership with Paul. He remained faithful to his identity, and it was this faithfulness to encouragement that bore fruit later. John Mark was not only restored, but he also became the author of one of the Gospels. A destiny that perhaps would never have been fulfilled if Barnabas had given up on him there. What are you willing to sacrifice for the restoration of another person? Do you prioritize efficiency over grace when faced with a choice between getting the job done and not giving up on someone? Which do you choose? How much does grace truly cost you? And what kind of legacy are you building? One of perfect performance or one of faithful restoration? After the separation from Paul, Barnabas made a decision that would change the course of his journey and reveal even more about his profound character. He chose to follow his own path, away from the spotlights of Paul's burgeoning ministry. But without ever leaving the mission, he took with him John Mark, the one in whom few still trusted, and returned to Cyprus, his homeland. The Bible doesn't detail the steps of this new journey, and the silence surrounding Barnabas at this point speaks volumes. He could have tried to insist on staying alongside Paul, or perhaps simply stepped away from ministry altogether because of the conflict. But no, he chose to continue, faithful to his identity. Even if far from the more famous narratives that would now focus on Paul and his new companions, Barnabas never sought the stage. His mission didn't depend on prominence, but on faithfulness. He knew where God had placed him, on the path of the forgotten, of those who needed a new chance, of those who were still under construction. Cyprus wasn't just a return to origins, it was familiar territory where he could restart, invest in Mark, and continue preaching. He didn't abandon the ministry, he just changed routes. The break with Paul, although painful, didn't affect his passion for God, nor his vision of encouragement. He didn't carry grudges, he carried purposes. And he didn't need the company of the great to feel useful. All he needed was a heart willing to obey. Barnabas lived what few can live, the humility of leaving the center of the story without leaving the center of God's will. He didn't fight for space, nor did he try to compete with Paul. He just kept going. His decision proved that his ministry didn't depend on titles or associations. It depended on conviction and obedience. While Paul gained notoriety and wrote letters that would shape the New Testament, Barnabas disappeared from the biblical pages with the same lightness with which he had appeared. But the impact of his decision wasn't lessened. By continuing with John Mark, he was planting something silent, something that would blossom over time. His influence became invisible, but never irrelevant. This choice to walk outside the brilliance of the great stories shows a mature, resolute Barnabas, faithful to what God had entrusted to him. He followed his own path, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for the calling, love for people, love for the grace that never gives up on those who are still being molded. The restoration of John Mark is one of those stories that aren't built in an instant, but in silent steps of patience, faith, and love. And at the center of this reconstruction is Barnabas. When everyone turned their face, he extended his hand. When Paul didn't trust, Barnabas believed. When the mistakes seemed to have defined Mark's future, he refused to accept him as lost. This decision to invest in a discredited young man became one of the greatest demonstrations of grace in the history of the early church. John Mark was still immature when he abandoned the mission on the first trip. Perhaps fear, homesickness, or the sheer weight of reality had overcome him. The fact is that for Paul, this was a serious failure. But Barnabas saw deeper. He knew that failures don't have to be definitive. He himself had already bet on someone everyone had rejected, Saul. Now, he was facing a new chance to lift up a cracked vessel and turn it into a useful instrument. During the time outside the main narratives of Acts, it is likely that Barnabas walked with Mark in silence, teaching, praying, correcting, inspiring. He didn't charge perfection, but presence. He didn't demand performance, but willingness. It was there, away from the great preachings and spotlights, that John Mark was restored. Not with haste, but with consistency. Not out of obligation, but out of love. And this silent influence begins to appear strongly in the letters of the New Testament. Years later, when Paul writes to Timothy in his second letter, already an old man, imprisoned near the end, he asks for something surprising. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me for my ministry. That same young man whom Paul had refused was now considered useful. This didn't happen by chance. It was the fruit of a careful, faithful work done by Barnabas behind the scenes. In addition to that, John Mark is widely recognized as the author of the Gospel of Mark, one of the 4 accounts about the life of Jesus, a man who almost gave up, but became a voice for millions. Someone who, if it depended on the impatience of men, would have been forgotten. But thanks to the restoring gaze of Barnabas, he was recovered, trained, relaunched into mission. Barnabas's influence in Mark's life shows us that true discipleship isn't shaped by haste, but by constant presence. It is believing in what the other doesn't yet see in themselves. It is watering when everything seems dry. It is staying by their side, even when everything says to abandon them. Barnabas didn't need great pulpits. He transformed lives one by one, and that echoed for generations. Where is God calling you to minister in the shadows? Who are you called to pour into, even if no one else notices? Are you willing to step away from the spotlight for the sake of another's restoration? What silent work is God asking you to be faithful to, even if the world never applauds it? Barnabas didn't write letters like Paul. He didn't speak at councils like Peter. He didn't have grandiose visions like John. And yet, his impact echoes on every page of the New Testament. His legacy is like the root of a mighty tree. It doesn't appear above ground, but it sustains everything that grows. In the early church, he was that kind of presence, essential, firm, but almost always away from the spotlights. From the very beginning, when he sold a property to support the community, to the very end, accompanying John Mark on a journey of reconstruction, Barnabas always acted behind the scenes. He was a bridge between Saul and the apostles, an encourager of new converts, a protector of the fragile, an encourager of the forgotten. He wasn't worried about fame, but about faithfulness. He didn't seek the stage, but purpose. His life was a constant seed cast on difficult soils, trusting that God would give the growth. When Paul became the great apostle to the Gentiles, there was a Barnabas behind him who opened the door. When John Mark became useful for the ministry, there was a Barnabas who insisted on him. And when the church in Antioch needed someone to consolidate the new converts, it was Barnabas who was sent. He wasn't the face of the mission, but the heart beating behind it. The book of Acts even changes the order of the names over time. First, it is Barnabas and Saul. Then, Paul and Barnabas. The highlight migrates, and Barnabas doesn't fight against that. He understands that his role was to prepare others, and then to leave the scene, like a foundation that sustains, but doesn't compete for brilliance with the construction. Like a river that waters, but doesn't expect recognition. It is curious that after the disagreement with Paul, Barnabas disappears from the main narratives. But his silence speaks more than many words. He left no traces of division. He wrote no defenses. He nurtured no grudges. He simply kept serving. And that, in itself, is a legacy. In a time where many desire the center, Barnabas teaches us the power of influencing from the margin. The impact of his life is perceived, not in great registered deeds, but in the fruits that others produced after passing through him. Paul, Mark, Antioch, the communities that were born, all of this carries the indelible mark of Barnabas's encouragement. His inheritance is made of restored people, open doors, and strengthened hearts. He was the type of leader who forms other leaders. In the history of the church, few have been as discreet and at the same time as decisive as Barnabas. His legacy, invisible to hasty eyes, is eternal before God. Barnabas wasn't remembered for impactful speeches or resounding miracles, but for something much deeper: his heart, a generous heart, an open heart, a light heart ready to give, to trust, to restart. He lived what many preach, but few practice. His life was marked by choices that seem small in human eyes, but they changed eternal destinies. And it is from this heart that the greatest lessons we can carry are born. First, Barnabas teaches us that generosity goes far beyond money. Yes, he sold a property and gave it to the apostles, bought an admirable act. But his greatest delivery was of trust. He trusted Saul when everyone doubted. He trusted John Mark when no one else believed. He gave space for others to grow. His ministry was more about lifting people up than lifting structures. While many accumulated control, he released paths. His heart was also free from the desire for prominence. He gave up the main leadership without resentment. He ceded space for Paul to flourish. He walked alongside without competing. He let his name become smaller as long as the kingdom grew. This humility is rare and powerful. He didn't need to be the center of the story to feel part of it. All he needed was the certainty of doing God's will, even if far from the records and human glories. Another unforgettable trait of Barnabas's heart is his sensitivity. He saw beyond the flaws. He saw the hidden potential. He didn't label anyone for their mistakes. Where others saw giving up, he saw immaturity. Where there was rejection, he offered welcome. His ministry was like a shelter for those on the margins. He restored with words, with presence. With patience, Barnabas also shows us that the true fruit of the Christian life is in people, not in positions, not in public achievements, not in statistics, but in the lives touched, in those who were raised in silence. Yes, Paul was great, but before him, Barnabas opened the door. Mark wrote a gospel, but before that, Barnabas held his hand. The church of Antioch was strengthened, but it was Barnabas who consolidated its base. Finally, we learn that a generous heart doesn't expect a return. It loves. It invests. It lifts up. Even if it doesn't see the immediate fruits, Barnabas disappeared from history without a sound. But the fruits of his delivery continue to grow to this day. He was like the breeze that refreshes, like the root that sustains, like the soil that welcomes. In a world that values applause, Barnabas invites us to live for the real impact, not for visibility. To be a healing presence, a word that lifts up, a shoulder that sustains, a true son of consolation, as God calls us to be. What kind of legacy are you building? Is it loud or quiet? Is it visible or unseen? Are you willing to be a root, a foundation, a silent encourager who changes eternal destinies, one person at a time? What does it mean for Date to be a true son or daughter of consolation today? This isn't just a story about Barnabas, it is a mirror. What do you see?